of water or wrinkling paper or whatever that doesn't disrupt the presentation. But good afternoon. I'm Dave Clutter. I'm Executive Director with Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin, and I just wanted to welcome you to our first ever closer look virtual conservation program. We're all great. The team is grateful to have you here. I'm grateful to have you here. We have some board members on this call today. So I wish we had some, yeah, there's one of them, Linda from Arizona. Don't be jealous. But it's sunny here anyway, Linda. So, but you've received a special invitation today because of your commitment to conservation and support of the work that we do together here at the foundation. So thank you. We're grateful for your partnership in conservation and thought that this type of event it was the least we could do to show our gratitude for all you do to forward conservation here in Wisconsin. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Heidi Roop today. It's a real pleasure to have Dr. Roop with us today. She is an internationally known climate scientist and communicator, and we're very grateful that she's made the time to join us during her many teaching and traveling commitments. So thank you, Dr. Roop. Dr. Heidi Roop is a Wisconsin native. She grew up in Appleton and did her undergraduate work at Mount Holyoke College in geology, Arctic climate change, and rural studies. From there, she received her master's in geology from Northern Arizona University and her PhD in paleoclimate and atmospheric science from Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. Dr. Roop is the director of the University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership and an assistant professor of climate science and extension specialist at the University of Minnesota. She also serves as the director for knowledge transfer for the National Science Foundation funded Coldex Science and Technology Center. Her research and extension programs combine cutting edge climate science and effective science communication to increase the use and integration of climate change information and decision making at multiple scales. So from city to state, national, even international levels. Her climate science research takes her around the world from Antarctica to California to even the shores of Lake Michigan here in Wisconsin and Minnesota. Her recent science communication efforts are focused on her book, The Climate Action Handbook, which outlines in a highly visual format everyday ways that we can contribute to collective and individual climate solutions. In addition to her appointments in the University of Minnesota, she also is an affiliate assistant professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Washington and serves as expert advisor to a range of organizations and agencies as they seek to build climate resilience within their own contexts. We will host a Q&A at the end of this presentation, so please, if you could, put your questions in the chat. If you have questions about that, you would just go at the bottom of your Zoom page, and you should see the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom page. I was going to say that if you had questions about how to do that, just put in the chat that you have a question for how to find the chat, but I don't think that would work. So you're on your own for this one. So anyhow, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Heidi Roop.
All right, I believe I'm up and running. Hello, everyone. Thank you, David, for that generous introduction. I go by Heidi. It's still weird to hear Dr. Roop, but I work with a lot of young ones, and they usually call me Dr. Roop. So anyway, here we are. As David mentioned, I am a Wisconsin native, currently occupying Minnesota, which of course comes with its risks. And I don't necessarily advertise I'm from Wisconsin very readily over here in the land of 10,000 lakes, although I will note that Wisconsin has more lakes than Minnesota. I'm with a friendly audience today. So my presentation, I've been invited to share a little bit about what we're doing in your neighbor state of Minnesota as it relates to climate research, and importantly, moving science and decisions onto the landscape and supporting a forward-looking and proactive approach to climate risk management. This is inclusive of a range of sectors and the criticality of conservation. So today I'm excitingly able to situate a talk around three really essential themes, including the imperative that we communicate more around climate and its risks and why it matters, and importantly, what we do, advancing and accelerating collaboration and thinking about new collaborations and how we invest our varied resources and strengths in collaborating to accelerate action in the face of a climate crisis. As I was on the public radio today talking about how we know very clearly this winter is a great, I used to call them postcards from the future, but climate change is here and standing on our doorstep. And we also need research to inform what actions and steps make most sense. And this is really critical in the conservation space as we think about things like adaptive management, facilitated migration, habitat corridors, really thinking about where do we get the biggest bang for our buck, but how are we proactive? Because as we know, investments on the landscape, particularly in the context of conservation, don't necessarily take foothold immediately, but these are long-term strategic decisions that we're making and investments that we're making, and considering climate and our future risks in those decisions and investments is critical if we want to try to get it right, or as best as right as we can with the information at hand. So when as you heard from my bio, sort of overwhelming, I bring a lot of identities into the space. More often than not, people think I wear a lab coat. I rarely do that anymore. Did that a lot during graduate school. But I have the great fortune of there are many who's I am that I bring into my climate work, including the efforts that I engage in at home as an individual concerned and caring about the planet, and a small human that I am responsible for, or maybe who controls me. She's 4, so we debate about who's really in charge. But as a scientist, I'm also a mom. I'm a passionate community member, and I learned from my parents who happen to be on this call and are great supporters of me, as well as organizations like this that bring you all together today. So you will see sprinkled throughout this the many identities that I carry when I do my work, and engage in climate in as many decisions as I can on a daily basis, both professionally and personally. And I encourage you to think about the many identities that you bring to this work. I think a lot of people peg us scientists as nothing but science, but there are a lot of motivations beyond data, our values, our faith, our commitment to community, the well-being of children, that motivate us to do this work, and commit our careers to things that are often very challenging, both personally challenging and professionally challenging. Okay, so as any good climate scientist, I'm going to ground us in some science. I've sprinkled in some new slides here. This is not a data-heavy talk. We're going to talk a lot about solutions and approaches, but I thought I'd just sort of situate us all in the science. And unsurprisingly, we know quite a bit about climate change and its impacts and the solutions that we need to deploy. So to save you from having to read the most recent 5th National Climate Assessment, which sits at over probably 1,000 pages, and the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessments reports, these are the main things that you should know about our warming world. We know very clearly that climate change is caused by us. We know that it is here now and not only a far off future phenomenon. This winter is a great reminder of how natural climate variability and climate change amplify in a very warm world. We know we've committed to change, so we've locked in certain change, which asks us and challenges us to make some critical choices. We know that there's a choice in that the more we emit of greenhouse gases, the worse it gets. So there's a very clear connection between the actions we take and the impacts they have. We know we have to reduce our risks and exposure to climate change through adaptation or preparing for climate change, for those changes we've already committed to. And then most importantly, we still choose. We have a choice. The history book is not yet written, but the chapters and the words are being put on the page every day. And the time is urgent to act in any and every way we can to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. Just to sort of situate us, 2023 was an exceptional year. My climate scientist colleagues and I are quite frankly shocked by what unfolded, not entirely unexpected given moving into what we call a strong El Nino phase, which tends to lead to warmer than average conditions in our neck of the woods. But this graph from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is showing you temperature change between January and December 2023, showing you how much warmer or colder it was relative to an average. And you can see the blue colors would indicate that it was coldest or colder than average, whereas the hot colors with the brightest red showing the record warmest temperatures, land and ocean temperatures recorded. So we know that 2023 was the warmest since records began in the mid 1800s. 2023 was about over 2 degrees Fahrenheit above the 20th century average, which is incredible when you think about it. And we have recorded and documented 28 weather and climate related disaster events in the United States with costs exceeding $1 billion. To situate that number, the annual average number of events between 1980 and 2023 was around 8.5 events. And in the most recent 5-year average, that average jumped up to 20.4 events per year. And again, these are just the events that have been documented with damages exceeding $1 billion. And NOAA itself admits that these numbers are likely conservative based on what they factor into the cost estimates that come out of individual, again, weather and climate related disasters. This is showing the change in December. I know we've been talking about an exceptionally warm winter in the Midwest in particular. This map shows you just how warm. This is the difference from average December temperature compared to that average between 1991 and 2020. So we're not even reaching deep back into historical time for this comparison. But you can see that in our neck of the woods, we were around 11 degrees Fahrenheit above average. Which again is just extraordinary when you think about the context. And this is just December warmth. Here in Minnesota, it was our warmest and wettest December ever recorded since 1895. And Wisconsin is also getting warmer and wetter. So even when we zoom out and look at patterns over the historical record, so these are observed changes, we can see that annual precipitation is increasing, and in some cases statistically so. So these maps are produced by WICI, which is the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, an amazing organization, one in which we are learning from and building around as we build out our program, which I'll share more about in a minute. But WICI has really set the stage for the region, is an incredible organization, an entity that partners between state agencies, particularly the DNR and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So if you haven't and are not familiar with that resource, I highly encourage you to check it out. They have assessment reports for climate for Wisconsin, and they produce a lot of the future climate data similar to what we do in Minnesota to service the state and decision makers as we seek to build resilience to climate change. So we can see on the whole that Wisconsin is getting warmer and wetter. And as in Minnesota, the most pronounced warming is the nighttime temperatures, as well as our winter temperatures are increasing. Those cold days are less and less likely. So the graphs on the right are actually comparing an observed change versus projected change just in one variable. This is nighttime warming. And you can see that already we're seeing statistically significant warmth in the wintertime, some statistically significant, but also increased warmth from the 20th century average in springtime. And you can see that as we move forward into a warmer world, by mid-century, we expect winters to get more pronounced in warming along with our springtime nighttime temperatures. This is just one variable among many you can pull from their synthesis report, which includes looking at the increased frequency in days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, changes in precipitation patterns, snowpack, and of course the implications of these changes on things we care about, like our landscapes and our communities and our health and well-being. Importantly, in Minnesota, or Wisconsin and the Midwest broadly, sorry, clearly I gotta come back into my Wisconsin identity here. I gotta take off the shell. I usually hide it, like I said. We know in the region, and this is one of the real challenges when I work with decision makers and folks like municipal government and local and county governments, is that we have to hold two truths simultaneously in the region, which is that it is getting warmer and drier in some cases, and we are moving through and between these wet and dry extremes more frequently and more regularly, and more quickly. So we have to basically plan for extreme wet and extreme dry, and for them to happen back to back and move between those two extremes more quickly. And so let's say you're a water manager or someone trying to manage a forested landscape. This becomes a really difficult challenge to grapple with when you think about what are the management decisions that I'm going to make under this future climate. So thinking about what are our solutions that we can deploy, what are management actions. There are all sorts of frameworks, and we don't have time to go into those, including especially within the natural resource management and conservation space. There's a lot of different frameworks to be used for adapting landscapes under a changing climate. Some of them involve resisting the change, some involve adapting to the change. There are a whole range of different frameworks we can use to work through how to manage these difficult truths. Okay, we also know that climate change is really costly, and it is even more expensive if we choose to do nothing. We understand, and this is a report that came out from the Office of Management and Budget and the Executive Office of the President in 2022, that says under current policy pathways, so these are commitments towards climate action that we have made nationally and factoring in global commitments, climate change could reduce our national GDP by 3 to 10% by 2100. And we can look at things like crop insurance subsidies and those costs, and we're talking millions and billions to billions of dollars in annual losses. So the fiscal risk of climate change is immense. No matter which aspect of the economy or community you look at, we know the costs are there. They will be realized. In some cases, we already are, and it is more expensive if we do nothing. In Minnesota, actually, the Nature Conservancy conducted an interesting report and assessment that they delivered to the legislature last session that showed for every dollar invested in natural climate solutions, including things like conservation, preservation of lands, conversion of peatlands, and a whole range of natural climate solutions, that the return on investment was around $8.55 for every dollar invested by 2050. So for someone who loves to clip coupons and get a good, nice ROI, I'm like, we need to do all of that. Who doesn't want to take $1 and turn it into $8.55 of benefits? So we know that engaging and interacting with and authentically integrating ecosystem and nature-based solutions into our solutions landscape, as we think about the built environment and our interactions therein, we know that there is significant return on investment. Basically, it is smart to be proactive, and it is smart to be proactive in a climate smart way that more meaningfully engages our landscapes as climate solutions. We also know that there are a range of ecological services that are provided by the landscape, and this is an example from the 5th National Climate Assessment Midwest chapter. I bring this up in part because I think it's really important to situate not just this sort of weird, like 2.12 degrees Fahrenheit. It sort of doesn't really mean much to most people, myself included. But when you think about what are the impacts of this warming, right? This warm winter is a great example to talk about what do we lose when we have warm winters? What do we lose, for example, when we lose our ice-covered inland lakes? There are implications for recreation, for subsistence, for education and research, ceremonial impacts, right? Our natural environment is part of who we are as humans and brings a range of cultural as well as sort of physical changes and ecosystem-based changes on the landscape. So we know that climate change is accelerating the loss of beings, connections, and access to land for Indigenous peoples. It's compromising a range of recreation. We think about things like the Berkey. Many of the sled dog races in Minnesota have been canceled this year or postponed. There are real impacts that stem from these changes that impact community, identity, mental health and well-being, our economy, our safety. And again, critically, we know that nature-based solutions are essential in the mix as we think about how we build and embrace the opportunity that climate change poses to do and design and engage in our landscapes differently. So this is a really sobering one, again, sort of out of context, but when we look at what we stand to lose through continued production of greenhouse gas emissions, how warm does the planet actually get? And this is from the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment report, showing that global surface temperature averages at the end of the century are very likely to be higher by around 5.4 to 10.3 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the global average, right? This isn't taking into account the exceptional nature of Minnesota and Wisconsin, for example, because we are warming among fastest in the nation, outside of our friends in Alaska. This is the globe. It's the whole globe on average would warm by over 10 degrees Fahrenheit, up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit under very high emissions. Fortunately, we're not on that pathway, but this is the imperative of the choice. This visualizes the choice we are making, or in many cases, not making today. Very low emissions actually gives us the ability to bend the curve, to actually cool the planet from where we are currently, because we can limit warming under very low emissions to around 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit as a global average. Unfortunately, the science and the policy commitment suggest that we're lurching, if not accelerating, in a very fast car towards more like an intermediate emission scenario that's going to put us closer to the 3°C range. But we will see where we get and how quickly we can adopt more clean energy technologies and deploy a range of techniques, many of which we already have in hand. We don't need technology to save us to reduce the global average temperature. And this is driven by greenhouse gas emissions. So every increment of warming matters, and so does every action. Okay, so this brings us to the standard head scratcher, which is, all right, Heidi, got it. There's a problem. The crisis is here. What can we do? Okay, so this is two parts. I'm going to talk to you about what can we do from the context of an organization. And then I'm going to talk to you about what can we do collectively, you and I do, through leveraging our strengths and our passions towards solutions in this landscape. Okay, so this is how I feel honestly on a lot of days. I don't really know. Some days I just, want to crawl in a hole. And so I, in my career, have had the great privilege of being able to do a lot of things and see a lot of landscapes and see landscapes under profound change. I have had what I would amount to, I don't know, I was in my mid-20s, a crisis. I was sitting on the margins of the Greenland ice sheet thinking, this science is really cool. I'm doing things and seeing things that no one in the world has. This is fabulous. But is it going to change things fast enough to save what I'm sitting on, right? This Greenland ice sheet. Am I doing enough? And I felt that I wasn't. And so in that moment, I decided I needed to pivot my career towards application and communication and coordination, and challenge the academy, higher education, as it were, around what skills were valued and what approaches were most valuable in the context of climate change, and how we could really partner to bring basic science into practice. So I took that confusion, which again, admittedly, I still have probably on every day I make that face. That one just happened to be recorded in front of 1,000 astronomers, including an astronaut. So I put it up there mostly as a reminder that it sure is embarrassing to be me sometimes, as with all of us. I'm sure we all make things, but when a professional photographer captures that, I remember just being so upset when I got that photograph through. And now I use it to poke fun at myself all the time, because it really does capture this question around what do we do? And when we step back, we know that climate risk management boils down to two simple things. We have to prevent the problem from getting worse while we prepare for those changes that we've set in motion. And we have to do both. So prevention is mitigation, and preparation is essentially adaptation. And in some cases, they overlap and there are co-benefits. Soil health is a great example of a co-benefit. And I will challenge the traditional delivery of this climate solution, which is that soil health, investments in soil health are awesome for a variety of reasons, primarily reducing erosion, improving water quality, and a co-benefit is that healthy soils sequester more carbon. We usually talk about it in the inverse, but I think the co-benefits are very well demonstrated for investing in healthy soils. And so that's a great example of a co-benefit that emerges from these investments in mitigation and adaptation. Unfortunately and necessarily, I will be there caveats here. For too long, in my opinion, we have been laser focused on only one half of this important equation we need to balance: prevention and preparation. Prevention, as say with our healthcare system, is kind of we're sort of out of whack in that relationship, right? Preparing and preventing. We have to think not only about mitigation, but also adaptation. And our national discourse tends to focus almost exclusively on mitigation, even when there are really exciting and salient co-benefits that might motivate someone towards action. I know a lot of land managers who are maybe not really excited about greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but they're super jazzed about the water quality that would cut improvements. They're excited about having recreation lands that are healthy, wildlife that are thriving to accelerate, to ensure their recreation and say some of their lifeways like hunting remain intact in a changing climate. And so I think we are missing an opportunity as we think about the necessity to talk about both of these things, mitigation and adaptation. Adaptation is a beautiful door opener in many cases, but also something that requires a lot of investment. And the science says this very clearly. This rarely makes the headlines, but when the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment reports came out, I'm sure you heard we had 1.5 degrees C, 10 years left. The next decade is critical. Those same reports stated that it is also critical over the next 10 years to accelerate implementation and investment in adaptation to close this adaptation gap, this resiliency gap, right? How well we thrive and the extent to which we experience the negative impacts of climate change are really dependent on how well we balance those two aspects of our climate risk management portfolio. And we aren't necessarily ringing the alarm bells around the necessity to prepare. We see more and more of this in the national discourse, at least I do. I'm very tuned into it. Storms in coastal Maine in December, record storms, and local town managers coming and saying, we had a plan, but we thought we had more time to prepare. And I think the case is that we know now increasingly that we don't have as much time as we thought and that we have to get moving. And so this is the driving force behind the organization that I lead and have been helping to build out, called the University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. And we essentially work to support communities in understanding and managing their climate risks. I'm going to share a little bit about the type of work we do. There are great analogs to what we do to what is done in Wiki, which is an incredible organization. As I said, Wiki serves on our advisory board as well. Dan Bimott and Steve Vavris, who are great. We partner across the region. We know we have a lot to learn and we have to coordinate. It turns out that habitat ecosystems don't really care about our geopolitical boundaries. They will do what they do. And it's our job to think beyond, say, state boundaries so that we are coordinating in ways that are effective and impactful and leading to the outcomes we most want to see on the landscape. But as an organization, we provide fundamental climate information and information around the risks that the state is facing. This is done through high resolution climate projections. We actually jointly serve up information in coordination with Wiki around future climate risks in the region. We partner with the state on developing metrics and indicators for understanding how do we know we're actually achieving resilience on the landscape? How are we moving plans into action and knowing whether we're doing enough or not, and in the right places for the right species, for the right communities. And so we're partnering at a state level to think about how do we define adaptation, how do we measure and track these critical investments. We develop, and I'll share a little bit about this, our extension programming. So I'm at a land grant university and I have an extension appointment. I'll share a little bit about that for those who aren't familiar. But this really means being a front door. We are the front door to the university, but we also situate ourselves across the landscape. I like to sort of call it the phone a climate scientist friend, right? Helping people understand their risks, implement plans, understand what might work, and facilitate decision-making that factors in climate change. Do a lot of state and federal engagement, and a range of public engagement and other training. So I'm just going to give you a couple examples of programs that we run and are building out. One is in partnership with the Minnesota Corn Growers Association, as well as our Department of Commerce. Maybe folks you wouldn't expect would come together. But we are working and partnering to develop a climate smart agriculture program that's bringing new climate data into decision making around proactive agricultural management on the landscape. So we serve a range of producers at a range of different scales, from row crops to specialty crops, to think about what are these projected risks and what do we need, what management strategies work today, and what sort of investments and strategies and regulations do we need in place to ensure sustainable and productive agriculture out into the future. And so we have some new data and tools that we're serving up that we can share. Another thing that I think is really interesting, and there have been requests and partnerships emergent in Wisconsin to talk about this work, but we've partnered with the private sector and our another entity on campus called the Center for Sustainable Building Research. And we are working with architects and engineers to think about those natural climate solutions, but also to develop critically workflows, because right now you would be maybe not surprised, but there is a very small percentage of our built environment, when new buildings are built or weatherized or someone's doing a renovation, very few architects and engineers are actually designing those systems for the climate of the future, which we know is coming, right? And in many cases is already here. So how we're designing systems, heating and cooling, the siting of buildings. Almost none of that includes future climate, despite the fact the buildings we're updating, that we're renovating, or we're building new are having a usable life of anywhere between 70 to 100 years. Yet the files that are being used to drive those decisions are frankly out of date and incorrect. And so we're partnering to actually think about, how do climate scientists like me actually develop something that's useful? Turns out it's way harder than it sounds. So just like us giving people a bunch of really complicated future climate data doesn't actually translate into use and application. And so we're sort of, this is our second year. We've got 2 more years of funding to really build out these workflows and then train architects and engineers and landscape designers on how to future-proof, or at least plan for a climate change future when they're working on these critical, often large dollar investments that are going to determine the shape and function of our built environment and its interaction with the natural environment for decades to come. And that's fun because I get to work with architecture students and others who think about the world in very different ways. And I would say most of this work is about building shared language, because I have been in 3-hour meetings where we realize that we've actually been saying the same words, but they mean very different things, depending on whether you're a climate scientist or an architect. So we're building a shared vocabulary and a deeper understanding of how we do our work. So this is coordination and collaboration and partnership toward improved outcomes. And then I'd say this is probably one of the things that I'm most excited about in the work that we're doing, which is that we were able to work with the state legislature to actually develop a dedicated climate extension program, which is a recurring investment in situating climate expertise and technical assistance across the landscape, leveraging our extension infrastructure. So extension in Minnesota, as in Wisconsin, serves every county in the state. There are regional offices and infrastructure already in place to support these staff. And we're building them out in an interdisciplinary way so that we can support communities, whether thinking about how are we going to manage private and publicly held lands, as is a conversation up in northern Minnesota and our forested landscapes, or think about how do we manage the interactions between agriculture and, say, a range of these natural climate solutions. How are we going to get into carbon markets in a way that's strategic, that enables producers to still grow food while also reducing their footprint, both in emissions as well as bringing some of those water quality and natural habitat benefits. So we are putting people across the state really focused on the criticality of the issue, but leveraging extension. And for those who aren't familiar, I realize now in the interest of time, I removed this slide, but for those who aren't familiar, extension serves, there are 112 land grant institutions and organizations across the country. They exist in every state. There are tribal community colleges that are also land grant institutions. And our responsibility and the expectation from federal, state, and county governments that invest in our programs is that we bring evidence-based solutions onto the landscape to solve the most pressing problems that show up in communities and in different sectors in our state. And so we are working to actually bring on experts in many of the sectors: agriculture, human health and well-being, planning, engineering, forestry, water resource management, that we're bringing in extension educators in all those domains, but who also have a foundational knowledge base in climate change and climate risks and climate solutions. And we're developing training and capacity building and providing technical assistance in all of those sectors in a coordinated way, in hopes that we can accelerate the timeline between, say, having a plan and doing something with that plan. And in this moment in time where there is a range of federal resource on the landscape, trying to help communities and state agencies actually unlock that plethora of federal funding to implement, to do, because now is the time, and there's actually money on the landscape that many have been waiting for a long time. Okay, so what do we do? So now pivoting away from the Climate Adaptation Partnership and this sort of, well, Heidi, that's not really relevant to me. How do I show up in this work? I'm going to pivot to my confused face again, and I did have it in here twice, and then I thought better of it because I don't want to show you my confused face again. But I spent a lot of time, and still do, scratching my head around this challenge, which is that increasingly people are talking about climate change being real, seeing it on the landscape, it mattering to them, they're worried about it. But not really knowing what to do or how to connect the experience to solutions or action. And so there's sort of this dot that's missing. How do we connect these dots? And I think that's each of us. And there are a range of things that we can do both in our professional and personal capacities to help connect these dots between the problem we see and increasingly feel, even though most Americans report that climate change won't happen to them personally. That number I find shocking still. It's only around 40% of adult Americans think climate change will harm them. Higher to harm future generations, will harm wildlife and habitat, but unlikely to impact them personally. So we have work to do in connecting the dot and making this issue relevant to people where they are doing what they do. But also we have to think about how we connect people to the impacts and the actions. What do I do? How do I show up as part of the solution? And so this led me on my own learning journey, in part because I was called out. And I realized that the ways in which I was talking about solutions was not inviting, was not inclusive, and in many cases wasn't actionable. Many people go around, many people like me, go around and before embarking on this process of writing the Climate Action Handbook, talked a lot about, buy an electric vehicle or put solar panels on your house. At the time, I was renting a house. Solar panels were a non-starter, right? Had a homeowner in charge. Someone else was in charge of my housing. So that was like, and that turns out there's a lot of us in the United States who don't own homes and don't have agency to say, electrify or update their own home. Where you can, please do. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But there are so many ways that people can contribute to climate solutions, that they can help people connect those dots. It is, yes, acting in ways like buying an electric vehicle. If you can afford an electric vehicle and you can transition to one, please, yes, do. But we also have to value all the ways that people can show up in climate solutions, whether that's art or education, engaging elected leaders, thinking about policy, what we eat, how we manage our own waste, right? Food waste and others are major dials that we all have agency to turn and improve upon. What kind of alcohol we drink. Turns out that was a really fun chapter to write. I got to write one on how we imbibe with climate in mind. A lot of things I didn't know, but what I did learn, and this was unsurprising, but I lacked the specificity, which was that climate solutions surround us. Whether we're thinking about energy production and transportation, which is where we sort of tend to lean for thinking about solutions because it's critical and it's a huge source of emissions nationally, but there are all sorts of things that we can engage in, including what we do and how we recreate. Conservation are critical aspects to individual agency and building skill in being a savvy climate consumer and someone who's integrating climate into many of the decisions that we make on a daily basis. Our shopping and consumer choices, things that we do to improve our health and well-being, ways that we're engaging civically or in our communities to accelerate climate action. And so the Climate Action Handbook unpacks all of these 10 chapters, 100 actions. And I thought when I was approached to produce this book, I thought there are no way there are 100 things. And it turns out there are many chapters that did not make it into the book. So the way the book is structured, perhaps unsurprisingly given some of the previous content, which is that I really focus a lot on what we can do to prevent the problem from getting worse. I bet you can guess what the next thing is. I will put the slide. So for those of you who didn't catch on, Peter and Connie Roop, who are on this call, are my parents. And Dad, I don't know if you know this, but I poke fun at you every time I give a talk because this yellow action in the middle is about driving and how little choices can reduce our emissions from, say, our transportation. And this, of course, by no means am I advocating that this is the most emissions savvy or impactful thing you can do. But again, it's really fun to poke fun at your parents. My dad drives as slow as physically possible, sometimes unsafe. And now he's got a great slogan about a bumper sticker being something like, I drive slow for climate, do you? Because it turns out both, getting your road rage in control and driving below 65 miles per hour can not only bring cost savings, but also emissions reductions. And so there are little things we can do. Again, this is not, they put solar panels on their house. So that is like the emissions win. But these little daily decisions to drive the speed limit, for example, can be little behavioral nudges that move us toward action and hopefully help us feel like we're not doing nothing. So of course, we also have to prepare for changes we've set in motion, and we can do this in our own individual and daily lives. In the instance when I am in a crowd with someone who focuses on emergency preparedness or emergency management, this middle one, this is a more fun question. I can never see on Zoom all of the people. So you can raise your hand if you'd like. I won't see it all. David, maybe you can give me a shout out. But how many of you on this call have an emergency kit, a stay bin at home or a go bag ready if and when some form of disaster strikes? Okay, I see Kate raised her hand. Thank you. That's one. Okay, you all are about just right on. See, this, I should be tallying this. This is like a great experiment. Two. Okay, we've got two. Okay, so here is something that you can do today or maybe tomorrow. I'll give you a little bit of time to get it together. Sounds really silly, but building our own resiliency and being prepared for a moment when we might be experiencing a climate disaster or a natural hazard event or some other emergency, that preparedness goes a long way. How many of us don't want to be able to show up for our neighbors or be able to tend to our basic needs? It turns out, as we zoom way back to one of the first slides, right, there have been $28 billion disasters in this country, right? That average has increased from 8 to over 20, right, in the last 15 so odd years. Our emergency management systems are not set up, they're not prepared, they're not invested in sufficiently to grapple with the scope of the reality of the challenge for when these impacts occur. So we can help, for those of us who have the ability to do so and the resources to do so, we can reduce our burden on systems that are going to be overstretched and overtapped more frequently and more regularly by making these emergency kits, right? Preparing ourselves and being able to show up for our neighbors to be able to manage during these events means that we can triage, our emergency managers can triage because the scope and scale of what we're likely to experience is only going to get worse. And so these are little ways, again, behavioral ways we can work to build our own resiliency. As a consequence of this, and I think I've read about this in the news, I've heard communities get together. That one person on the email listserv has been like, okay, all right, everybody, I'm going to buy the backup power battery for these 3 or 4 households on this block. Someone else will raise their hand and say, I'm going to get a backup battery too, So we all know that we can like charge phones and have radios, and then someone will say, I'm going to get the like water filter system. They now make these cool water filter systems for larger numbers of consumers, and people are building their own sort of neighborhood resilience hubs. I think that's awesome, right? So these are, again, little things we can do. They're not the whole solution. We need to invest in natural climate solutions. Again, there's 100 things in the book that you can work through. I'm not going to give you all 100 more slides because I'm near the end here and I don't have 100 slides. But there are 100 things we can do and more. And I want to invite you, as you work to either sustain or continue your climate solutions journey, to really think not just about your carbon footprint, but your climate action footprint. Again, how do we prevent and prepare? And there's so many ways we can show up. Okay, so at this point, someone usually says, all right, Heidi, give me the 5 most impactful things you can do. What are the 5 things I should do at home? What are the 10 things everybody should know? And I'm going to give you 5 here, but they're not going to be probably what you want to hear. And this is in part because as I was working on this book and as I was thinking about how do we invite more people to be part of the conversation and more people to see the work they're doing as connected to climate, I tried to steer away from assigning a value judgment around what was impactful or not. EVs are really impactful if you're going to reduce emissions, and we should all be driving EVs, but they're not affordable yet, right? So we'll get there. That's not to dismiss that, but we have to be thinking about inviting everyone in, because there are so many things. We can look at so many statistics like food waste and dietary changes. They're based on the premise that a majority of the global population will adopt those behaviors. How are we going to get there if we don't invite everyone to feel like they're part of the conversation and that they're making a contribution? And this isn't to say do one thing and forget it. We call this single action bias, like my one and done. I'm going to do one thing and then I'm a climate hero and pat myself on the back and continue driving a Hummer, right? That's not what I'm saying. But here I'm going to give you the 5 things that I think we should all be doing as we think about our climate solutions journey. And then we'll hopefully have about probably 7 minutes for questions. Okay, so first, you got to center your work in your strengths and passions. That's not for me to tell you. That's for you to think deeply about what gets you out of bed in the morning, what motivates you to show up and do and engage and continue to do and engage, because this work is hard and we need it for the long haul. So think about what you're good at, right? For me, that might be data and graphs. For you, it might be creating art or engaging in conversation. It might be developing a budget or thinking about financial management. It might be cost benefit analysis for an organization. It might be raising funds for conservation, right? So think about your strengths and passions and center your work there. Okay, you've got to use your energy wisely. And I mean this in 2 different ways. So where you can, opt into energy efficiency and adopt renewable energy. Sometimes you can do this directly on your home, as in solar panels. I've seen a lot of organizations transitioning to, say, geothermal heat. Super exciting opportunities here. There are also increasingly opportunities to buy into community solar farms and to have a proportion of your energy as delivered by your utility come from a new renewable energy source. Sometimes there's an upfront cost to that, but it's unlocking the potential for the utility to actually access more renewable forms of energy so we can transition our grid from one that's mostly fossil fuel based to one that is predominantly, hopefully, run by renewable energy. We can do a lot to improve and weatherize our homes. So energy efficiency and renewable energy where you can. And many utilities and local municipalities support the energy efficiency piece, and many states are adopting weatherization programs or investing more in weatherization programs that enable healthy energy efficiency upgrades, and ensuring that as we close the envelopes of homes, people are also living in healthy environments and breathing healthy air. We also have to use another form of energy wisely. And I usually query the crowd here, and folks say, well, the yellow is the sun, and we have to use sun and water and wind in ways that are smart. No, we have to use our communications energy wisely. These dots are proportional to, they are proportional to the percent of adult Americans who are alarmed, concerned, and cautious about climate change. That's the yellow sun saying, oh. The middle is the 17% of adult Americans who report being disengaged or doubtful. And the blue dot is the 11% of the adult American population that indicates they are dismissive of climate change. I cannot tell you how many times I have heard people say, well, we just need to convince the deniers. I'm here to tell you they are only 11%, and 72% of people are looking for you. They're looking for a trusted conversation with a friend or a family member or a colleague who is willing to engage in authentic conversation, because this space and the conversation and the din and the noise is confusing. And it is one ripe with mis and disinformation, right? I can't tell you how many emails I get on a regular basis, and how many things that scientists produce are misconstrued or miscommunicated to serve a specific agenda. So we need to use our energy wisely. We need to focus on the sun. Those 72% who are primed and ready to do, but don't know how to act, don't know where their opportunity is. And that is where we need to invite people in. There aren't 72% of Americans that kind of right now, right there, this is a significant proportion of the American population. They are primed to do, they are concerned, and they want to have a safe, trusted conversation. That is not with a climate scientist like me. That is with you, a friend, a family member, someone in the same faith group, in a book club, right? Wherever you are, there are people around you who maybe aren't willing to say something because they haven't been invited authentically in and don't know how to ask potentially questions that they might feel they're not safe asking or they're going to get pushback from. So we need to think about how we communicate. And that's my other challenge to you in the top 5, is to commit to communicate. A majority of us think they're a problem, but only 35% of adult Americans report talking about climate change on a regular basis. Therein lies an opportunity. We're worried, but we sit in silence. And this is actually well documented in the literature. It's called the spiral of silence. We're worried about it, but we don't think the people around us are worried about it. So we better not say anything, because it's just going to be a really difficult conversation, or it's going to create a family rift. More often than not, it's about how we approach the conversation. Silence is not the solution. I'm not going to say it's not hard. We can build skills around how to have effective climate conversations. But the one trick is lean into values. There are things that we all care about and love that are a risk from climate change. It might be about ice fishing. That might be your inroad into talking about what are we going to do with this weird and wacky weather, right? It doesn't have to be Heidi, climate scientist. The annual average temperature was 2.12 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the 20th century average. I mean, most people, right? You're all like, Heidi, my eyes are glazing over. Okay, so we have to commit to communicate, and then we've got to do, and a big part of what we've got to do is look to the ballot box. And I'm not just talking federal elections. 96.3% of our elected leaders are elected at the local level, not the federal level. Of course, the federal government is critical. They move a lot of resources to state and local leaders who make decisions about where that money goes, right? It is a critical ecosystem. But more often than not, when we look down the ballot, we aren't informed. And those are people that we bump into at the grocery store. And those are people who are driving over the same potholes that are being made worse because of freeze-thaw cycles and climate change. So we have to think about the whole ballot box, right? For up and down, because a majority of our local leaders are making critical decisions about things we take for granted every day, that drinking water, the water in our taps and our toilets. Those decisions are being made at local level. And I can tell you that I learned today that only 6% of publicly owned wastewater facilities in the state of Minnesota, out of the 800, only 6%, only 31 have some form of climate plan in place to reduce the risk of, say, sewer overflows and a whole range of impacts. So, right, that for me is a call to action. We need to be thinking about how we move toward more climate smart decision making. There should be way more than 6% of publicly owned wastewater facilities thinking about future floods. We know a majority of voters want climate action, and more increasingly, there are states with climate action plans in place. So there is a way to move your ballot and encourage action, because most states and regions increasingly have plans in place for the future they want to create. And with that, I'm going to encourage you to consider the individual ways you can contribute, The ways you can engage in your community to accelerate action. That might be this community, that might be this group of people having another conversation around what does this mean for the work that we care about, the things we invest in, the legacy we want to leave. And then critically think about collective action. And I'm going to close here, and we have a few minutes for questions. Sorry, I went a little long. But I do a lot of reading around climate change, as you can imagine. And for those who you are like, this crowd is likely familiar with Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer. She wrote Braiding Sweetgrass and is an incredible climate advocate. And she wrote these words and also spoke them in a video as part of Climate Week in September. And I think these are just, it's a really potent reminder about the moment we have and the opportunity we have, but also the responsibility we must take. And she said, the earth asks that we give our considerable gifts. There's your strengths and passions again. In return for all we've been given and in return for all we've taken. We are called to a movement made of equal parts outrage and love. And if those things don't move you toward action, in some days, let me tell you, it is mostly outrage. And in other days, it is mostly love that moves me towards wanting to commit my life to a climate-ready future for all of us, for our children, and of course, those beings on the landscape whose future we are choosing now. So with that, I will close and thank you for bringing your love and time and expertise to this opportunity.
Excellent. Heidi, thank you. If everyone could please come off mute. Good. Now I'd like to give Heidi a warm hand. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bravo! Bravo!
Good. Thank you so much. That was excellent. So we have a little bit of time for Q&A. Heidi does have a hard stop here. But our Director of Philanthropy, Marta Weldon, is going to take questions. I think she was monitoring the chat. Do we have anything for Heidi, Marta?
We do. We have one question, and it goes like this. I also have a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I'm wondering if you have words of wisdom for balancing the sense of urgency and anxiety I have as a conservationist with a sense of hope I'd like to have for my young children and future generations.
Oh, that's a tough one. And I always get choked up on that last slide too, because wow, it calls us to be, yeah, I'm outraged for my children, right? For my child, and all children. We're not doing enough. That's us, right? It's everybody on this call. We all have responsibility, I think, and to pivot in a positive way, I think an opportunity. And so, I talk a lot about the future we want to create. I was just having a climate conversation with my daughter the other day, and I thought, I'm not sure this is age appropriate, but we're looking at these bur oaks and they're starting to bud out, and it is February 4th, and I am panicked about these beautiful ancient trees that surround our home. And so we were having a climate conversation, and she hugged the tree. And I thought, I have to be doing something right. And so I think some of it is being honest, and also in building this love for place and for the planet, because I think we aren't apt to fight for things that we don't deeply care about and value. I can credit my parents for engendering that love of place and planet for me. Oh man, all those car rides to the Kettle Moraine State Park that I resented as a teenager. I can't tell you how many eskers and moraines I looked at as a kid, but then I went on to study glaciers. So, maybe it was part of their plan. But I think, yeah, it maybe doesn't feel like enough. But I think being honest and nurturing that care of people and planet are ways I'm trying as best I can to get it right.
Thanks, Heidi. I am aware that we're at time. We do have one more question, but I'll suggest this. We are going to send you a follow-up survey. Please put your questions in the survey and give us feedback, and Heidi will get these to you. And if you wouldn't mind taking a moment, answering a few of these questions, we'd all be really grateful.
Sure. Yeah. And the planting one, I'd say go to your extension service. Lots of great resources. The Nature Conservancy and other similar organizations are also increasingly putting out tree planting lists, forest adapted trees, and other. I know our Minnesota Extension launched a climate resilience gardeners program for our master gardeners, thinking about how your own natural landscape around your home can add and build resiliency to climate as well. So those are a few just quick ones I saw in the chat related to planting.
Okay.
But I'm also happy to share resources. But I thank you all, and I apologize. I went a little long, and I have to hop up to take my child to swim lessons because, you know, floods and lakes and enjoying the natural world.
Indeed.
So I apologize for the abrupt end, but thank you all for this time and your commitment to conservation.
Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you.
Really well done. Thank you. Marta, any last words you'd like to share with the group while we have some folks on here?
Just thank you again for your commitment to Natural Resources Foundation, and look for the follow-up survey, and we would love your feedback, as this was our first ever Closer Look virtual webinar. So thank you again very much.
All right. Thank you all.